Hello everyone, I hope you're ready to talk about some Tyranids because that's what we're doing today. Because just this past weekend, almost all the datasheets out of the Imperial Armor Compendium were spoiled on YouTube, and we're going to talk about them. We got some incredible new datasheets for Tyranids, and that's what I want to cover. Obviously, every faction in the game has gained or lost something. I talked in my previous video about the Imperial Armor Compendium book that a lot of factions in the game were going to be losing stuff. Obviously, that's happened. There aren't many new datasheets coming in, but I mean, it kind of feels like Christmas because a lot of these datasheets have been entirely rewritten. The face of competitive 40k is going to be changing, I think, for the better. A lot of the really, really powerful stuff, especially out of Space Marines, Relic Contemptors, Landspeeder Tempests, all that stuff that we complained about at the very start of 9th edition, that has been significantly toned down. Leviathan Dreadnoughts are significantly toned down. A lot of datasheets have been simplified so that they're mechanically similar to other things in the game, so they're not quite as unique, and there aren't quite the same level of rules, like unintended rules interactions that Forge World has put into their datasheets beforehand. And it's awesome. I'm so excited. And a lot of this stuff has been totally rewritten and repointed to be playable in standard games of 40k. So let's talk about the Tyranid datasheets, and especially the most exciting ones, the big scary beastie boys that everyone is really pumped about. Now, Tyranid's got a couple datasheets in here. Meotic Spores, Stonecrusher Carnifexes, and Sky Slasher Swarms all got datasheets. They're not very exciting. The Stonecrusher Carnifexes, I think, got their profile's pretty good, but they got a points increase, and the Carnifex chassis is already pretty bad. So I don't think that's not very interesting. Sky Slasher Swarms are rippers that fly, okay, and then Meotic Spores are basically the same. So we're not going to talk about those right now, but we are going to talk about the really big, exciting stuff. I'll start by ripping this Band-Aid off here, the Harridan and the Heirophant Bio-Titans. Now, the most exciting thing about these datasheets is that they were made effectively sort of soft-made playable in standard matched play games. Because previously the Hierophant had a 2,000 point cost. I think it was over 2,000 points, so you could not legally take it in a 2,000 point game of 40k. It was also bad. Like, there was no way that you would ever want to take one, even in bigger than a 2,000 point game, unless you just really wanted to put the model on the table. And its point cost was basically halved. It's now 850 points, so it is playable in a standard game of 40k. It's a Lord of War choice, so you just need to take a super heavy auxiliary detachment to bring it in. We'll talk about the profile real quick now. I will preface all of these profiles by saying there's a little bit of a grain of salt with these. I think it's an unofficial leak that's brought out with these. There was a book review posted, and all of the datasheets were in there. Unfortunately, the quality of the video itself was not incredible, so you can't really see the text super well. In some cases, we may get some stats wrong, and if we do so, I do apologize. But the Hierophant Bio-Titan, 850 points, comes in with a 32 wound base, toughness 8 with a 2+ save and a 5+ invulnerable save. A pretty hardy stat line, but for 850 points, you're expecting a lot of toughness there. Now, honestly, when we talk about these big Tyranid monsters, the most interesting thing is that they all benefit from all of the Tyranid defensive auras that you can create. So Venomthropes, Malanthropes, all of the Spore Cloud abilities, they all affect both the Hierophant and the other monsters that we're going to talk about. The Maleceptor, the -1 damage aura, that also affects it, and it's got a 5+ invulnerable save itself. You can Catalyst on top of that. You can, High Fleet Leviathan for a 6+ damage ignore. There are a lot of ways to make this pretty difficult to kill. You can also just give it light cover, like with the High Fleet Jormungandr, so you can get it to a 1+ armor save. You can make it relatively hardy. Now, for 850 points, I don't know if it's hardy enough. Your Eradicators will still eventually kill it. And the biggest downside of all of the datasheets that we're going to talk about today is the obscuring keyword. Unfortunately, a lot of terrain on the tables currently are relying on that obscuring keyword to block line of sight to things behind them. And unfortunately, as soon as you are 18 wounds or higher, then you are not affected by obscuring. So even if you are behind a piece of obscuring terrain, as long as your opponent can draw true line of sight to you, then you will be seen and they can shoot the crap out of you. So this could open up situations where, for example, there's a ruin with windows in it, and you can stand inside the ruin or behind the ruin. You can see through the windows at a big titan or a monster or something, and you can shoot at it, and it cannot see you back because it itself does not ignore the obscuring keyword. That's one of the reasons that Titanic style models are really terrible in 9th edition 40k. Also, just the name of the game being aggression and objective scoring. These things do not have objectives secured, so a lot of times you can steal objectives away from them. They are relatively good at clearing out their own objectives, but that's a more reactionary game, and that doesn't really score you points in 9th edition. You have to be able to clear an objective and hold it down and maintain it with objectives secured, and that's very difficult for these Hierophants to do. Now, so for those reasons, despite the fact that this thing has an immense amount of incredible firepower, I don't think it's particularly playable. The other reason is even more damning, which is that it is too big to be deployed most of the time, which sucks. The model on TTS, I did a little test. The model on TTS was a little bit small compared to the dimensions that I found for the Heirophant online and on the Forge World website. So I scaled it up appropriately so it matched those dimensions. And unfortunately, if you are playing a long table edge deployment zone in the recommended board size, so the 44 by 60 inch board, it cannot be deployed. So what that means is that when you go to deploy it, you place it touching the back edge of your table, and it can't do anything on the first turn. It can't attack, it can't shoot, it can't charge, it can't move. It just hangs out for a turn, and you get to shoot it. So unfortunately, given that several of the scenarios use those long table edge deployments, and if terrain is poorly placed for you, then you could run into even more issues moving or deploying the Heirophant. So I think the Heirophant specifically, for those reasons, is still bad at 850 points. I'm not sure that there's a points level where a model like this would be playable. I'm sure once you drop it enough, it becomes good. Just the guns themselves become worth the points cost. But unfortunately, I'm not super excited about the Heirophant. I like that it's able to be played, so you can actually buy your model and you can bring it with you. But there are a lot of mechanical issues with a model this large. Now that's not quite the case for the Harridan, the next model that we'll talk about here. The Harridan comes in at almost exactly the same defensive stat line. It has a 3+ save instead of a 2+. It's also toughness 8, 34 wounds, and it does not, I believe, have an invulnerable save. But what it did get, and this is so cool, is the airborne keyword. So it got the aircraft keyword. It works like aircraft now. That does mean it does not contest or control objective markers, which is too bad for it. But it flies like a plane, and that's super cool. So you do everything that you do with a normal plane. You can pivot 90 degrees when you start to move. It has a minimum movement of 20. It has the hover mode rule, so you can determine for it to lose the airborne keyword so it can charge and be charged, but then loses its minimum movement. It's also hard to hit, so you don't even have to put it in a spore cloud. And it's super duper fast. It moves from a maximum of 45 inches, I believe, is what we're looking at on this movement value here. It also comes in weapon skill, ballistic skill 3 with, interestingly, basically the same suite of weapons that the Heirophant has. The Heirophant has, in addition to a bunch of these little, these short-range lash attacks, it has 2 dire biocannons. So each of them, I believe, is heavy 8 for strength 10, -3, 3 flat damage. And then its melee attacks come out at strength 10, -3 flat, 6 damage. The Harridan has precisely the same profiles. So it's only 5 attacks, I believe, instead of 6. That looks a lot like a 5 to me. And with the same melee profile, strength 10, -3, flat 6 damage, rerolls 1s to hit. Great. Dire Biocannon comes in with 2 of them at strength 10, AP3, 3 damage. This is also much cheaper than the Heirophant, and more importantly, much smaller. So it not only is it based, so you don't use the hull measurement rule to measure distances for it, so it could potentially overhang the deployment zone a little bit if it needs to, but also it's just a lot physically smaller than a Heirophant. So the Harridan seems eminently playable to me. I don't know if it's good. I don't think it's good. Moving this big thing 20 inches around the table seems very difficult. You might have to hover mode a lot, and then it loses its hard to hit. It's not that hard to kill. But I mean, you can pack a lot of survivability up onto it. Even if you don't want to use the supersonic, you can just put a Malanthrope or Venomthropes next to it to make it -1 to be hit. You can put Catalyst on it. You can put a 5+ invulnerable save with Adaptive Physiology on it. Lots of stuff to do. It's very cool and shoots hard, and it has some other stuff going on. I like that the Harridan has become a playable profile. Let's talk about some other playable profiles. All right, so here we are with another blurry screen grab, and we're going to be talking about the Heirodules next. Now, these are, I think, pretty controversial so far, because here's the changes that are a big freaking deal. First of all, they moved from Lord of War to heavy support. So that's already a big deal. You can just put them in a battalion detachment or a patrol detachment, just like anything else in your army. They also were reduced in cost by about 50%. They dropped from in the 400s or 500s that they were in the previous version of the datasheet to 235 for the Scythed Heirodule, 275 for the Barbed Heirodule. That's the gun version, which is crazy. That's insanity. Now they're starting to compete with actual Tyranid units that you would compare them with. You know, they're around a similar points cost to like a Winged Hive Tyrant with that's fully loaded. They're a little bit more expensive than a lot of like the horror specs, Maleceptor, that style. The Scythed Heirodule is about 60 points more than that. And for that, you get some pretty devastating melee stats, a pretty good gun, and 6 extra wounds. Now, there are some downsides to these guys that we'll talk about. And the first one is that 18 wound characteristic right there. And for exactly the same reasons that we just talked about the big Titanic units being maybe not so playable, the Scythed Heirodule has exactly the same problem. It is 18 wounds, it is not blocked by obscuring terrain, and it does not benefit from dense cover. Now, that said, it is a lot easier to protect with your small defensive auras, so the Maleceptor and the Malanthrope or Venomthropes. Malanthrope, I should mention, also has an entry in this book. I think its range is increased by 6, and it's like 150 points now. I still don't like it, but, you know, there it is. You can the 6-inch aura makes it much easier to use, for sure. So, big problem with that 18 wound characteristic. You can just shoot it through windows and buildings and things like that, and it has no recourse. It can't shoot back. The bases on these things are phenomenally large. They are 5-inch diameter bases, which makes it very difficult to position around terrain and around intervening models. Sometimes they're going to get stuck in your own army. It's very difficult to use them with any finesse. You have to plan your moves pretty far ahead. Now, unfortunately, for that 50% points decrease, we also lost a couple other things from the Scythed Heirodule here. It went down to 6 attacks, which is unideal. That's not a great swath of attacks. In the Discord server earlier, we were comparing it to a Redemptor Dreadnought. It's very similar to a Redemptor Dreadnought. With Warden of the Ancients nearby, they have almost exactly the same attack profile. The Redemptor hits 6 times with strength 15 instead of 10, and you can source full rerolls out of the Scythed Heirodule. Potentially, it rerolls once to hit all the time. Prey Sight can give it a weapon skill of 2+, and you can use Voracious Appetite to reroll all of its wound rolls. On the flip side, you can source reroll 1s to both hit and wound on the Redemptor, and it will wound anything that's not toughness 8 on 2s innately, so it's a little bit better. So they're actually very similar once all of their buffs are active, which is disappointing, because the Redemptor, in addition, while it is probably easier to kill, it's only toughness 7, which is a big deal, and 13 wounds with Duty Eternal rather than 18 wounds, which probably ends up being relatively similar. The Redemptor is also, much less expensive and has a bunch of guns on it. So it's a little bit sad for the poor Scythed Heirodule. That said, the gun on this thing is really good. It's a 3d6 18-inch range flamer, strength 6, neg 2 AP for 1 damage. It is a monster, so you can pathogenic slime it for flat 2 damage, which is okay. Unfortunately, strength 6, with a random profile, so you could potentially pathogenic slime and then roll into 3 shots and fail to wound all of them, trying to wound on 5s or whatever. That's a little tough, but you don't have to roll to hit, so that's good. The melee profile obviously is pretty good. It hits for strength 10, AP3, D3 plus 3 damage, which is really nice. It's going to automatically punch for 4 every time you hit it. So those little outriders, those Gravis armored guys, all that 3 and 4 wound stuff, just get that right out of here. They just automatically die if this hit goes through. Now, for 235 points, I think this profile is actually very reasonable. I don't think that this is like broken or an auto include or anything like that. I think it's good, though, and I think it's certainly playable. It benefits from a lot of the Tyranid buffs that you can put on monsters. All of the Tyranid synergies work on this guy. I think it's great. There's a lot of interesting Hive Fleet synergies. You can do custom Hive Fleets for Prey Sight, potentially, or regenerating wounds. That's good. Hive Fleet Leviathan for a 6+ damage ignore. Basically, this gives this guy 3 wounds back, makes it 21 wounds on average, and make it potentially spike high and make it very difficult to kill. Hive Fleet Jormungandr puts it down to a 2+ save. Even Hive Fleet Kraken, once you try to get onslaught and overrun on this guy to getting the 3d6, pick the highest for advancing is a big deal. The threat range is insane. It can move 24 before charging with Swarmlord. That's all not new. That was stuff you could do on the previous version, but the previous version was also like 460 points. So this one is much better. The gun is actually a really smart include on the part of the designers. Instead of making it kind of a jack of all trades gun like the previous version, which I think it was a 2d6 range 8 for 2 damage. So it was less shots and lower range, but it also hit armor a little bit better. If you're bringing Scythed Heirodules in your list, the goal is to have the Scythed Heirodules themselves kill your opponent's armored targets. And having a gun that shoots infantry straight to death is super good. I mean, this just automatically kills a guardsman on a 2. Perfect. That's great. If you have a horde of OBSEC models, they're just going to get slaughtered. It's going to do an okay job at killing Space Marines. It wounds on 3s. They only save on 5s. Every 2 hits kills an Intercessor or equivalent. It's not great, but it's something. And I really like on this profile specifically that it can perform both roles. Playing 3 of them, you have 9d6 auto hits, and at range 18, it's very difficult to get out of range of that thing hitting you. So I'm excited to recreate the first episode of The Mandalorian with this thing, just acid spraying people to death. Now, I apologize for the title in the way of the screen cap here, but we also have the Barbed Heirodule stat line. This one's a little bit harder to make out, but from what we can see, it has a fairly disappointing ranged output. It has 2 biocannons. Each of them shoots for 6 times strength 8 -2 for 2 flat damage. So a total of 12 shots. It also loses 2 attacks from the Scythed Heirodule profile, so it's only swinging 4 times at the same profile. Weapon skill 3, strength 10 -3 for D3 plus 3 damage. Rerolls 1s to hit, but it also gets +1 to its armor save, which is pretty good. That means that it stacks with additional armor save buffs like High Fleet Jormungandr, even better. It goes to a 1+ armor save, and is generally more difficult to kill. It seems to me that what this thing wants to be doing is staying in the back and only using those 4 big punchy attacks late game to kind of close things out, while that 2+ save can keep it going against other anti-tank firepower. It's going to be saving -2 AP, crack missiles and stuff like that on 3s and 4s, and with additional buffs on it, -1s to hit and catalyst and so on. That's going to make it very difficult for enemy anti-tank armor to peel off. Now, unfortunately, the shooting isn't super impressive. It's just an exocrine, basically. It's got a little bit extra range, which is nice, but it gains a strength and loses an AP. Okay. The downside also is this is 275 points, so you're paying 105 points more than an exocrine. Obviously, it's more difficult to kill, but is that worth almost plus 60% of the cost? Probably not. It's probably not worth that. And the exocrine also have some additional benefits on top of that. The exocrine synergizes more naturally with High Fleet Kronos buffs, which is really what you want to be doing if you're shooting. The exocrine degrades more favorably. It never degrades past a ballistic skill of 4, essentially, because it gets down to a 5 and then gives itself +1 to hit. So there's definitely some poor comparisons between the Barbed Heirodule and the exocrine. In fairness, the Barbed Heirodule, that +1 strength is good. The additional resilience is good, but when for just 70 more points, you could just take 2 exocrines. It's, this thing doesn't really have a leg to stand on. It's also a little bit faster, but not much. It's move 8 rather than 6. But one of the big downsides is that the exocrines can use their mobility a little bit better because they can they can begin the turn hiding behind terrain and then move themselves around to ignore that terrain, to move, to get line of sight to things. And unfortunately, this thing just wants to start out in the open and get shot at because it doesn't benefit from any terrain, and it's going to have to move in order to get around line of sight blockers in order to get shots. So I'm really not seeing it for the Barbed Heirodule. The Scythed Heirodule, on the other hand, I think is pretty okay. Unfortunately, I don't love either of these profiles, but I think especially the Scythed Heirodule profile is very good at putting a bunch of wounds on the table and just slashing at people with big talons and shooting them with bioacid and stuff like that. It's a pretty well-rounded data sheet, and I'm pretty impressed. Now, the last one we're going to talk about today is one that I get questions on all the time, constantly. Everyone is asking everywhere, every Tyranid forum forever, how do we make the Dimachaeron work? And the answer was to wait until the Imperial Armor Compendium to come out and then just play it. There's some wins and some losses in this Dimachaeron datasheet. It's 235 points, I believe. A hefty sum. I was sort of expecting points decrease on the poor Dimachaeron here, but we got an increase. It looks like to me, now this is probably the fuzziest datasheet that we have so far. It looks like to me that it has 6 attacks. So basically the same damage output as the Scythed Heirodule with a little bit of upside. It's a big Scything Talons, reroll all hit rolls, not just hit rolls of 1, which is good. And it has a tail attack. So it has a 2 flat damage, AP 3, strength 7, little tail pins. So it's going to be hitting 5 times essentially. But only 6 of those are at its main profile, which is, I should mention, only strength 8 rather than strength 10, which is a big deal because other toughness 8 stuff's going to be a problem. -3 AP for D3 plus 3 damage. Full rerolls is nice. For 1 CP for Voracious Appetite, you're full rerolling both hits and wounds. Perfect. We're nailing it. We're really doing it. Now, interesting to me, the Dimachaeron kept its Leaper Killer rule down here, and that gives it the ability to ignore vertical distance when moving, but not just for normal moves or fallbacks or advances or stuff like that. It also affects charges. So this is basically one of the only monsters in the game that can charge over buildings and over terrain. The reason for that is that even if you fly, you don't ignore vertical distance for charging, and I don't believe that there are many, if any, other monsters or vehicles in the game that specifically ignore that horizontal distance naturally without having to rely on that fly keyword. So what you can do with this thing, and I think the way that it wants to be played, given that it is a lower toughness value at only toughness 7 than these other big monsters, is that it wants to duck and dive in and out of obscuring terrain. It can run over walls to kill stuff, then use overrun to get back over the wall, remain out of the line of sight, and just slowly attrition your opponent's army from there. It's basically the melee Hive Tyrant game plan, except it costs the same and is slower, and it punches vehicles better. I guess that's the difference. So if you've ever played a Smashy Hive Tyrant, you know exactly what we're doing here. You're getting in, you're picking your target, you're blowing it up super hardcore, and then you're running away. Now, this has a lot of advantages over the normal Smashy Hive Tyrant. The first one being that its melee attacks don't naturally suck. 6 attacks, strength 8, -3 AP for D3 plus 3 damage. It's just a straight upgrade to a Smashy Hive Tyrant. With some finagling, you can get a Hive Tyrant up to strength 8, but it only caps out at 4 damage, and this is 4 with an asterisk that it could go to 6. Its AP isn't quite as good, but that shouldn't matter because it has more base attacks. Like any other melee monster, the poor strength, the relatively poor strength at only strength 8 doesn't matter a huge deal because you're going to be saving that CP for Voracious Appetite every time it gets into melee. So while it falls down a little bit against toughness 8, with full rerolls, you can probably still get over the ledge to kill that stuff. Now, interestingly, one of the other really big benefits of the Dimachaeron now is that it saves you a lot of your targeted buffs elsewhere. For example, its Leaper Killer ability now gives it a 5+ invulnerable save naturally. So you do not need to put Dermic Symbiosis on this guy to get him his invulnerable save. He just always has it all the time. In addition, he has this weird Thorax Spine Maw ability where if he attacks you but doesn't kill you, you could take some mortal wounds, and if he kills you with those, he gets a 5+ damage ignore for the rest of the game, which means that he will not need Catalyst anymore as soon as he's killed something with that Spine Maw. Now, obviously, all of these monsters have access to a double fight from Tyranids, so probably what you're going to be wanting to do early in the game is charge, for example, 2 relatively mediocre infantry units, like let's say 2 units of intercessors. You go into one of them, you have full rerolls to hit, Voracious Appetite for full rerolls to wound, you murder it, then you trigger its Spine Maw rule on the second unit. Then, at the end of the fight phase, you double fight, kill that second unit, and overrun back to safety. You have a 5+ invulnerable, 5+ damage ignore for the rest of the game, and you can put your Catalyst somewhere else. That's sort of living the dream, and honestly, I think a big downside of this particular monster is that it kind of really wants to live the dream, where you're going to be jumping in and out of buildings and letting your opponent, and your opponent's sort of going to let you run over their army. But if it does so, it's going to be absolutely brutal. Now, the biggest downside to that game plan is that while it's not 100%, I'm pretty sure that number of wounds is 18. So this feels like such a miss. I literally would pay more points for the Dimachaeron if it had less wounds, because at 18 wounds, it cannot be affected by the obscuring or dense cover keywords. Brutal. Absolutely brutal. Now, there is a chance, this screenshot sucks. So there is a small chance it's 16 wounds, although it has been pointed out to me that it brackets at 9, and typically first bracket is at half of your wounds, which would be 9 if it was 18. It's probably going to be 18 wounds, which means that it can be seen through windows and through obscuring stuff and forests, and it never gets dense cover, and that just sucks because it's not able to play its game plan sort of with impunity. You have to be playing really good line of sight blocking terrain, which most people don't do. So a lot of times it's going to go in, it's going to do its thing, it's going to do some overruns, it's going to run around, and then your opponent shoots it to death with Eradicators, and you're like, oh, sick. The other thing is that despite its invulnerable saves and its potential damage ignores, only toughness 7 means that it's going to lose those 18 wounds pretty quickly. Unlike the toughness 8, which you can then buff even farther with Maleceptors and stuff like that, it doesn't do any of that stuff. So it also doesn't have a gun, and it's move 12, which is good, but it's not great. It can't innately advance and charge or anything like that, so you're going to be wanting to put Onslaught on it or double move it with Swarmlord to get it into range. So it needs a little bit of support to set up. And with all those asterisks, you would sort of assume that it was, relatively inexpensive for that, but it's actually like 235 points, I believe, is the points cost for it. So it costs the same as the Scythed Heirodule. It is easier to kill, it is slightly more maneuverable, and it hits a a little bit harder in melee, but you're missing the gun, you're missing the strength 10, you're missing a lot of other stuff. Still, I'm so glad that they were able to bring these datasheets from the realm of how do I make this work to a level of playability where I think it's actually worth considering in competitive armies. When you're building an army, you know, there are some niches that are going to be filled by Heirodules and Dimachaerons, and it's not every list. Some of the comments I'm seeing are saying that Dimachaerons are an auto-include in every army forever. No, that's not going to be the case, I don't think. But the power level of these datasheets is far and away better than their previous iterations. Like, the power level of the Forge World Tyranid options have just skyrocketed immensely, and it's very exciting. I mean, we're going to play some games with them. We're going to try them out. I don't have very high hopes for how well they're going to do, especially if you're leaning really heavily on these big monsters, but I think at the very least, it'll be fun to play, and hopefully they get to charge those Eradicators before they get killed. So that's the goal. So that's going to be it for me today. Just a really quick recap of the Tyranid rules that were coming out of Forge World. I really just wanted to talk about the Tyranid datasheet specifically because I'm very excited about them, and I think it's going to be super cool to put them on the table. And I would like to hear your thoughts as well. Now, in the datasheet deep dive series that I've been doing, I've been covering new releases and specifically new Space Marine releases from their latest wave. But if you want to see maybe a deep dive on some Tyranid datasheets or some of these new Forge World datasheets, let me know down in the comments, and we'll get that going. I think maybe we'll start some polls on which datasheet to cover next on the deep dive series. But for now, drop me a comment down below. And if you want to, leave a like and subscribe on the video. That'd be cool. Also, check out all these people on the screen right now. They are back on Patreon, and they're very nice. They get early access to videos, and they get exclusive videos, and shout-outs in the video, obviously. So you can visit them and join them at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, we have a new YouTube membership. And if you join, you can show off your support for the channel with some badges and emojis that you unlock, which is very cool too. So you can click on that join link down below beneath the video to jump into that too. Any support you can give would be greatly appreciated. Anyway, that's going to be it for me today, everybody. Thanks for watching. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.